Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Welcome to the Property Investor Show. I think this is the first panel, or one of the first panels, so thank you for getting up bright and early. Some of you seem to have travelled from a fair distance from what I'm hearing this morning already, so thank you for making that effort. So this panel is about the private rental sector. We've got an esteemed panel list here, the kind of the Yodas, really, of the private rental sector in terms of their 500 or so years of experience, or maybe not quite that, but close to. So hopefully what we'll do is kind of extol pearls of wisdom in terms of, first of all, what the market has done, as in the housing market this year so far, because it's been quite an interesting ride, I think. Then we'll get into what we think is going to happen next year, I guess, in terms of rental values, house values, and indeed, in particular, these guys' specialism is policy and regulation. Obviously, landlords, I think most would agree, have been rather hit over the last couple of years in terms of the government seem to wanting to squeeze landlords until the pip squeak. So let's see what's coming down the tracks next year. And ultimately, I think it's the question that we want to answer. Is it a good time to be a landlord? Is it a good time to invest in property still? And what does 2022 hold? So that's the kind of the premise, really, of what we're going to discuss today. We've got an hour. It'd be good if we can talk maybe for, I don't know, 45 minutes of that, and then maybe some questions at the end would be helpful. You know, it'd be good to get some engagement and feedback from you guys, and some experiences, some thoughts and opinions. But let's kick off with some introductions. First of all, Eddie Hooker.
Thanks, Russell. Eddie Hooker, I'm the CEO of the Hamilton Fraser Group. So some of you may know us from our brands such as My Deposits, one of the tenancy deposit protection schemes, Landlord's Own, which is one of the UK's largest online news website for landlords, Landlord Action and Eviction regulated law firm, and the Property Redress Scheme if you're a letting agent. We deal with complaints. Overall, working with about 500,000 landlords and 20,000 letting agents across the UK. And grateful and happy to be here.
Thank you, Eddie. And Chris Norris.
Hi, well, I'm Chris Norris. I'm the Policy Director with the National Residential Landlords Association. We are, as the name would suggest, an association for residential landlords. We came about because of as a result of the merger of two organisations you may have heard of, the Residential Landlords Association and the National Landlords Association last year, and it's been a funny first year for any new organisation, I think it's fair to say. We represent just shy of 100,000 landlords in England and Wales. And I suppose we're here today to talk about some of the policy horizon, but as well as providing a voice for those landlords, we also provide practical support. So quite a lot of the time working with some of our colleagues on this panel, actually, we provide a lot of advice, we provide discounted benefits, services to our members, and we try to provide a community for private landlords as much as we can through our events, through our presence at these kind of events as well, to make what is quite a solitary career, vocation, a little bit more community focused.
Brilliant. Chris, thank you. And to my immediate left here, David Cox.
Good morning, everybody. My name is David Cox. I am Rightmove's Legal and Compliance Director, having held a variety of roles in the industry over the last few years. I've worked with Chris at what was the National Landlords Association. I joined Rightmove just under a year ago now, having spent the previous 7 years running the letting agent professional body Property Marc. So huge amount of experience dealing with letting agents, with government in the private rented sector, and all the various laws that have whacked landlords over the last 15 years.
Indeed. David, thank you. And to my right, Marc von Grundherr.
Hi there, I'm Marc von Grundherr. I'm the director of Benham and Reeves. We are London's largest independent letting company. We do sales as well. We manage 3,500 units in central London, plus we have overseas offices. So these guys all help with policy and help in the background. I sit on the cold face, dealing with landlords, seeing what's happening on a day-to-day basis.
Good, thank you. So I told you it was a good panel. It is. Let's get into it by talking about the market, first of all. Who would have thought 18 months ago that the market would do what it has done in the last 18 months, despite a pandemic, economic uncertainty and so on? But obviously what we've seen in terms of house price terms is a huge increase, huge demand, fueled by the stamp duty holiday, of course, which Rishi Sunak introduced in June last year. House prices, although it varies, obviously there's no such thing as one UK housing market now. There's obviously huge regional variations, as I'm sure we'll talk about. But house prices typically are up in the last 12 months alone between 8 and 13%, depending on where you are and indeed which index. Obviously there's the Rightmove index, which David might want to talk about, but there's other indexes around the Office of National Statistics, Halifax, Nationwide, and so on. But they all paint the same picture in terms of direction of travel. So us property owners have kind of done okay, I suppose, including landlords. So I think that sets a very interesting backdrop. Let's ask the panel what their experience is of the market, either from their perspective, particularly if they are landlords themselves, or indeed from their clients and members' perspective. So, Eddie, do you want to kick off in terms of how you think the last 12 months or so has fared in the property market? Have we done okay?
Thanks, Russell. I'm going to echo what you said. Who would have thought? You're coming in, you've gone into a pandemic, everybody's panicking about the economy. We're very much a homeowner, property-based economy in the UK. Everybody likes owning their own property or renting out properties. But have a think about what happened during and after the pandemic. People wanted gardens because they're now working more at home, or they wanted a home office. And if they were in flats or they were in apartments, they wanted that space. Travel. People didn't want to commute. So they wanted to stay at home. So there was a little bit more available cash. A lot of the working population, certainly the white-collar population, is spending £3,000-4,000 of their available income, their disposable income, on travel. And suddenly, if you don't have to spend that, then you look to spend money on other things. Obviously, they can't go on holiday, so they look at maybe we can afford a bit more on the mortgage. Interest rates at historic lows, mortgage companies offering unbelievable deals, and house prices obviously were naturally going to go up. So I think it's been that, in my view, is why the market has started to overheat a little bit. And of course, the stamp duty holiday, certainly for owner occupiers, is quite sexy, even though landlords, second home owners, are paying a slightly more. What's the future for me? I think there's going to be a slowdown, in my view. I think this is an artificial bubble, in my view.
You don't think a crash, though, presumably?
I don't think a crash. I
think
property has been quite sustainable over 25, 30 years. I mean, the market goes up, the market goes down. If we're talking about if a crash only really affects people if they want to get out of the sector, get out of their property at that moment in time.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's a bit like the stocks and shares. I've got an ISA, which many of you guys will have. Over the last 3 years, that ISA has grown about 60% in value. Now tomorrow it could crash, but I'm not looking to sell that ISA at this moment in time, so I can ride it out. What I do think the market's going to do is slow down. We are going to have an interest rate rise. Yeah, that is if it's not in the next policy.
The Bank of England are talking about that being this year.
This year, so November the 4th is the date being looked at. If not, it will be a February increase, and then they're looking at 2 other increases over 2022, early 2023.
So it may well temper the market a bit.
I think
Chris,
so.
Your view on how the market's been and whether the increases we've seen are sustainable, I guess.
I don't know, has Eddie left anything to...
I'm so sorry.
That's what
we tried to
do.
Eddie could do his own show on his own.
Yeah, we should probably set that up. I think I'd echo everything Eddie said. I think there's one interesting point from the private rented sector's specific perspective, and that is that we are a counter-cyclical market. And you say, who would have thought? Well, actually, we track a lot of, we call them optimism indexes or kind of intention indexes. Sorry, am I not close enough to... Sorry. So we track a lot of this data in terms of experiential data, but also opportunity and what opportunities they're likely to take up in the future. And we started seeing really early on in the pandemic that we happened to do a big piece of polling last March. March 2020. And we saw our optimism in landlords for the future, their own businesses, just fall through the floor, which was hardly surprising because we polled at about the time that everyone was told to lock their doors, stay home, and the world was ending. And we thought that was going to be a trend we'd see all the way through the year, bearing in mind all of the changes to possession procedures, the bans on moving home, etc., and everything else we were all going through. But actually, by the time we hit the end of Q2, beginning of Q3 last year, landlords' optimism was up. It wasn't uniform across the UK. There's hotspots. I think if you were to look certainly in our membership at what our members in central London are telling you, you'd get a very, very different view to a lot of the rest of the country. But actually, quite early on, it was apparent that there were going to be opportunities there for landlords. And our members started to tell us that actually they were looking to acquire new property at a time when we were looking at fairly doom-filled predictions. So we saw that happening quite early on. We saw different parts of the country start to peak. We've seen an awful lot of interest in the southwest, the northeast and the northwest of England, for instance, and a lot of that is some of the demand leaching out of central London, central Birmingham, and people looking for a different experience, as Eddie says, looking for more space
and we should
around
talk
the
about
country.
regional variations later, actually, because whether it's rental values or house values themselves, there is this huge disparity. And actually, even in London, you can take, as Marc and Shaw can extol the virtues of the difference between one borough and another. David, you have a fairly interesting perspective, having all this data at your fingertips, being a Rightmove man. What's your view on what's happened and where this is going? Any kind of standouts, any anomalies?
So I think it's interesting that the property industry was kind of singled out as the first industry to be released from lockdown. So I agree with everything that everybody has said so far. When we went into it, the market kind of went into free fall at the end of March, beginning of April last year. But the 13th of May came along and it was the first industry that was unlocked. And from my perspective, I think the way the industry came out of that unlocking showed how professional it has become over the last few years, be it private landlords and self-managing landlords to the letting agency industry. And it gave the government confidence actually to start unlocking other industries, because we did, as an industry, take the rules and the guidance that the government gave us seriously, and we enacted them, which allowed the market to come back to strength quite quickly. And certainly, and Rightmove does not actually compare to 2020. It's using all of its comparables now to 2019 because 2020 was such a year that it wasn't really comparable. But we saw the market come back quite strong, and this year the market has been incredibly strong. I think anybody looking in the industry has seen huge appetite. Just to give you a few stats. This is Wednesday statistics versus the same day in 2019. Views for rental properties across the UK were up 41.1%. And if you just take London, views of properties on the website for rent was up 68.4%. Now, a lot of people do just look at Rightmove for the fun of looking at other people's houses. I will accept that.
The Rightmove voyeurs.
Indeed, yes, that's the polite word. But the real thing is demand. How many people are actually sending leads through the website to the agent? And if you think across the country, demand was up 41.1%, leads were actually up 76.8% across the UK. Not quite as strong in London. Demand was up 68%, which shows a lot of people are looking, but leads were only up 66.5%. So there is a lot of interest. Properties are flying off the market. And if you look at time on market, it's 34% down. So properties are literally flying off the shelves.
Is it an all-time low, pretty much, in terms of time spent?
I'm going to be honest, I don't know the answer to that,
close,
but it's going to be pretty close.
It's pretty close.
Certainly, we've got some of the lowest stock we've ever had because they are going so quickly. Actual numbers of properties coming onto the market, not that different, but
and
the
that
time.
will be the problem for anybody looking to buy, or indeed any estate agent, is of course stock. Talking of estate agents, Marc, you're evaluation. Obviously, you have the benefit of running a business that's both sales and lettings.
Yep.
Obviously, you're London focused, but you also have buyers and tenants from overseas.
Yep.
Obviously, you're in other territories. Your analysis?
So what David just said about, and Russell said about dropping figures, I just wanted to say something interesting. There's an internal portal in London which we can share each other agent's stock, and it's called Lonres, which the public can't access, but we can access it. And I saw the guy who owns it last week, and he rang me and wanted to see me, and I wondered why, and he asked why we had dropped our stock going on to Lonres by 90% over the course of the last 3 months. And he says an endemic problem. He thought all agents would stop loading stock. It's because we have no stock. We are running on the lowest stock levels I have historically ever seen. We are, in terms of, so we do these comparisons, which David talks about, compared with 2020, we're up 72% in volume. I'm not talking income, I'm talking number of lets, 72% more lets this year compared to last year. But compared to 2019, we're still up 30%. What's that meaning is there are many more people, and we're London focused, and I know there's been this huge talk about everybody exiting London and everything's going to be empty, you won't need to go to a restaurant because there'll be no one in it. But actually we're seeing the reverse. We're seeing people coming from out of the country now who are working from home. Everybody knows about the Goldman Sachs CEO saying working from home is an anomaly, and they pushed all of their IT people to their new Birmingham centre. So there's no more people in Fleet Street sitting in the Starbucks because they don't have desks.
Mark, there's I think a valid argument that all of this activity is kind of temporary on the basis that lots of people have pulled their decisions forward, particularly purchasers, because of course they've wanted to take advantage of the stamp duty holiday. So do you think in terms of volume and in terms of prices that this is sustainable? You know, are we going to see house prices increasing by 8 to 10% across the country again next year? Surely not.
I don't think you're going to see 8 to 10%. We're forecasting 5%, which we think is reasonable. The thing I think you will, everybody else is saying it's going to come off. I think you're going to see a little bubble from now on because you've got the restriction of travel ending. You've got people starting to come back in. I've had a client recently who was meant to be here in 2019. He couldn't come because he wasn't very well. He wanted to come last year and bought. He came over last month. He bought 12 units. And he was desperate to buy, and he'd been building the money to buy. And that bubble, the people from the Middle East who didn't come after Eid, they traditionally come after that period. People from Asia, they traditionally want to come when universities go back. They come, their child's in first year education, they go out and look and buy something near the university. That we haven't seen because, again, Singapore, Hong Kong, they have restrictions. So I think you're going to see a continued bit of a boom. I'm not saying 8 to 13%, but I think it will finalise about 5% when it's done.
Okay, right, let's get on to obstacles now as well. So the obstacles that landlords have faced. Before I do that, Andrew, how are you? You got a question?
Yeah, so
I said we'd do them at the end, but let's make it interactive and engaging, shall we?
It's quite important to address now. So
Yeah.
when panel are talking about increases, are you talking about, for many years, increases have just been, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about inflation or not, because inflation's been so low, it hasn't affected. But I really want the panel members to make it clear whether they're talking about inflation-adjusted rises or whether they're talking about absolute rises.
No. I mean, all of the house price indexes, whether you talk about rental or sales, so whether it's Rightmove, Halifax, Nationwide, ONS, are not adjusted for inflation. They're adjusted seasonally, and obviously everyone has their own methodology in terms of how they put those indexes together. But look, inflation, as we know, inflation now is, where are we, 4 or 5%? So of course that has to be taken into account. I hope in 6 months' time we'll be sitting here with inflation substantially lower as we've started to kind of get out the other side of recovery. But no, it's not adjusted for inflation. Let's talk about obstacles, because it's been a torrid time. We've actually got Paul Champlina here as well, of course, that knows all about one of the obstacles, one of the problems that landlords have faced, which is arrears and not being able to do anything about tenants that are in arrears. So maybe Paul might want to comment on that in a second. But Chris, what are you? What's your view in terms of what some of the obstacles that landlords have faced this year? What else apart from the huge problem of arrears, I guess?
Arrears have been a huge problem, but I would qualify that slightly. I think there's a lot of discussion about the presence of arrears in the market, and there's an assumption that, or there's almost the implication that the vast majority of households have had their income disrupted and therefore they haven't paid their rent. Actually, it's not been the case. I mean, our members tell us that, around 2/3 of our members tell us actually their income hasn't been disrupted at all. And that leaves a large cohort, don't get me wrong, that leaves a third of landlords out there, a third of 2.5 million people with rental income who have had some kind of issue. We're only tracking about 7 or 8% that have had serious problems, and they're the kind of people that Paul is dealing with. And when they're hit hard. You know, we're seeing really significant arrears because a lot of those arrears began before COVID. They began before lockdown. These aren't, by and large, the really severe cases, people who have legitimately lost their jobs, lost their income and stopped paying. These are people who took advantage of that period and, you know, have played the system. I think we're getting back to some semblance of normality. The courts have obviously been open for a while. Bailiffs have been able to operate for a while. We are getting mixed messages back from our members, in all honesty, about how bailiffs are operating and how they're interpreting the guidelines they've been given, and whether some households are still playing the COVID card to prevent getting possession back. And that's something that I know is a growing concern for us in that minority of cases.
And Eddie, are you happy to pass the ball to Paul Champlina for your answer?
Can
Paul,
I
do
just
you
say,
mind?
before Paul comes in, one big, I think, issue landlords may need to consider going forward is taxation, and to keep your eye on taxation. Obviously, the laws over landlording taxation have now settled down a little bit, but you only need to listen to the government, the opposition party, when they talk wealth and wealth taxes. The word landlord tends to run in front of all other cohorts.
Well, the landlords as a sector, they're seen as a cash
Absolutely.
cow, and not just by the opposition, but
Yeah.
actually by this Conservative
So I
government.
think it's make sure, guys, you get your numbers right, because things over the next 2 to 3 years from a taxation and your return on investment, your yield, are going to be impacted, I think, by tax.
And I think you're right, Eddie, and I think specifically if there are CGTs, so capital gains tax changes, you need to be thinking about what they might be and planning for that now. But Paul, I know you're not on the panel officially, but look, grab a mic. Just very quickly, just tell us about your experience of where the sector is in terms of arrears, and is it getting better, I guess?
Well, firstly, can everyone hear me okay? Okay. So firstly, I'll stand up. Not that there's a big difference, but anyway. Actually, firstly, just before I answer that question, on Tuesday I saw David Davis on the train. And yes, and you've got some views on Brexit, we won't go into that for this panel session. But he actually said that he has great sympathy for landlords, but he started talking like a politician and so forth, and we started talking. But on the arrears factor, and I've been running Landlord Action for 20 years. Yesterday alone, we had over 20 instructions at Landlord Action. We employed 3 solicitors in the last 4.5 months. Is that right, Ed?
Yeah.
From landlords and letting agents to start action. So obviously, you had 18 months. The court shut for 6 months. The bailiffs started working again on the 31st of May, ironically my birthday when it opened up. But there is a massive problem in recruiting bailiffs. Bailiffs are on £21,000 a year, and now there is a massive issue with COVID. I had one landlord that's owed £85,000. He actually came over to us, and the tenant defended the case 5 times because they said they had COVID. So the COVID card has still been and is still being used, but obviously the whole point why everything got slowed up is they didn't want a mass avalanche of homelessness during a pandemic and no vaccine.
Arrears definitely been a problem for landlords over the last 12 months,
Yeah.
more so than
Yeah, I mean, we've got a record amount now of landlords that have got over 12 months rent arrears. The landlords that had cases in the court system prior to COVID were the worst affected. And we've got a debt recovery department, and we're having more landlords now doing debt recovery more than ever before because they want to get money judgments.
So the courts are going to be clogged up, but looking forward to 2022, do you think the situation is going to get better for landlords in terms of being able to get their money from the tenants that
Trying to gain monies from a tenant is the hardest thing to do. That won't ever change and the debts will be bigger. My prediction is in 2022 there'll be 150,000 possession claims, which it didn't have those type of numbers as far back as maybe 2002.
What's normal? What would you say?
No, in 2019 it was 110,000. Bearing in mind, social housing providers did not issue any possession claims in 2020. So, yeah, I think there's going to be a lot more evictions. There's a lot more people going to be struggling on through inflation and costs and whatever. Yeah. But they will increase quite dramatically. But the courts are getting a bit better. There's a campaign which the National Residential Landlords Association, and we've supported, we work closely with them. They brought in review hearings, which is a complete and utter waste of time just to slow the process. But generally it will take you, after serving a notice, the best part of 6 months to get your property back.
Thank you, Paul. A good case there for landlord insurance, Eddie, I'm sure. I'll say it because I'm sure otherwise he would have said it. David, your opinion on the problems that have faced landlords over the last 12 months? I mean, other things apart from arrears, what else have they had to contend with? I mean, interest rates is one, I guess. The spectre of maybe having a variable rate buy-to-let mortgage, and that's now going to potentially get more expensive.
So I think landlords have COVID, the pandemic has been the key issue. I would say as well, with the end of the furlough scheme at the end of last month, I'm not necessarily sure we are out of the waters yet. There were a lot of people that were relying entirely on the furlough scheme for a long period. So whilst we've got a massive, as Paul has just said, build-up of properties that are going through the court system, and it's not just the private rented sector, as you said, the social sector, mortgage companies haven't been able to evict either. So we have effectively got an 18-month backlog of cases going through the courts and a court system that isn't operating at 100% and was not exactly the most efficient before the pandemic. We're then hitting furlough at this moment in time and the end of furlough. What impact is that going to have on rent arrears? Because the furlough scheme ended at the end of September, so they had their money to pay their October rent. What is going to happen when it comes to the end of October and they haven't got any money to pay November's rent? So
and universal credit as well.
And universal credit. Yeah. So whilst there is it's a good picture in terms of rent increases, it is a good picture in terms of demand and the desire to move. There is also, it's not all rosy going forward. We're going to have changes, I would imagine, in terms of landlord tax in the not too distant future, because the government has spent an unimaginable sum of money propping the country up over the last 18 months. And despite certain campaigners do think that the government can just print money and make it go away, that's not what government does. Government collects money from one place and gives it to somewhere else. It hasn't been collecting it in anywhere near the levels that it's been handing it out over the last 18 months. And therefore, there has got to be some sort of readjustment. I can't quite remember what the level of the national debt is at this moment in time, but it's
about $1 trillion, I think.
Yeah, it's unimaginable in terms of the amount that we collect on an annual basis. So we are going to have to start looking at that. Government is going to have to start looking at that. So there is it's a good time, but there are certainly going to be challenges ahead, and challenges dealing with the backlog of that which we've had over the last 18 months. Sorry to put down on it.
Thank you, David. Marc, look, we've talked about, I guess, the perils almost of being a landlord in terms of having to face the issues that we've just talked about. But landlords, and don't shoot me down in flames here, audience, but the landlords are pretty well off, aren't they? I mean, particularly when it comes to the value appreciation on their portfolios over the last 5 years or so. You've done some research on this.
So we've seen that landlords over the last 5 years, of value of landlords' properties have gone up by £223 billion. So that's a pretty significant increase.
It's £250 billion.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant amount of money that landlords have made. So yes, they're pretty well off, and interest rates have really aided that. But I think, one of the things that I worry about is tenant quality, and I think referencing is really key. And it's a bed of roses when you look at it, because everybody's talking like we are that there's no stock, and we're talking about prices going up, like I said, by £223 billion, and we talk about being able to use the courts to exit if everything goes wrong. 6 months to get a tenant out, I think that's really ambitious if a tenant doesn't play cooperatively. So my biggest issue with landlords is you need to go in with your eyes open and be careful, and really be careful. Don't just grab the first tenant because they offer you 10-15% more rent. See who the tenant is, and really, I think tenant quality, and I think that's one of the issues David said about furlough ending. We were fortunate. We only had 2% of our tenants on furlough, so, okay, we do act in central London, and London as, the whole of London. So we were very fortunate in that. But, and our debt rates are quite low, but you still have to, so many landlords come and they have a problem down the line. And the last thing I would say, obviously I'm an agent, and I think I'm not a bad agent, is be careful which agent you use. Doing it yourself using open rent is brilliant. It costs you nothing. But woe betide you if anything goes wrong, because it's all you behind the door going and knocking and getting your money back. And an agent won't want to take it back afterwards. So just be careful.
Other online letting agents are available. Let's talk about a quick snapshot from each on the panel. Let's talk about next year. So let's talk about tenant demand, whether we think that's going to be up or down, house prices up or down, recession, yes or no. Eddie, what do you think? So tenant demand, is it going to be as strong as it has been
Absolutely.
in 2021?
Tenant demand up. I think the stock levels which we've talked about will be continued to be a challenge. House prices, yes, an increase.
How much buy do you think? Putting you on the spot here. I reckon 5%. I agree with Marc.
I probably agree. 5% is probably sounding about right. Probably a bit more outside of the main conurbations.
Yeah. Do you think London will come back though? I mean, do you, Marc? I think London will come back. It's been in the doldrums for the last couple of years.
Yeah.
So
I think a good point that was made about the working from home issue. I think this is what I call employee enforced flexible working generally. I think eventually people will start drifting back into the offices.
I think they are already.
David's
going to find some data on this in a second.
Yeah, you'll always have some big businesses.
Come to me last. I'm just trying to find the sales.
You'll always have some big businesses that are wanting to cut their own costs, and they're coming to the end of their leases, and in London and the other large cities. But recession, no. I don't think there'll be a recession.
Even if inflation goes like that,
I think
interest rates go like that.
Inflation will continue. Look, we've got inflation's been driven as much by the interruption of distribution chains, the shortage of materials coming
and the recovery,
from the Far East.
Which is temporary.
Yeah, so I think you'll probably see inflation rising in 2022, and I think it will level out and start to drop back. And then, interestingly enough, you're into an election. And so I think 2022 will be and early 2023 will be a unique period, but then you'll start looking at the government will want votes, will then start wanting to...
So calls for optimism as a landlord or a potential landlord?
Absolutely. Unless you're trying to get out now, and with the current issues with... very quickly, can I just talk about these arrears? Let's not get overly worried too much about that tenants are not paying their rent. There are a number of tenants, for legitimate reasons, that are not paying the rent, and I think we mentioned that's what Paul's job is to look at, is those extreme cases. By and large, tenants are good. They are humans. They want their homes. They want to pay their way. Yeah? Where we are seeing a lot of problems with rent arrears is where landlords, and can I please use the word loosely, are lazy. They don't check when the rent is coming in. They don't check in with their tenant or their letting agent to see how things are. They don't check their bank statements. They don't look at or deal with repairs quick enough. And that's where I would suggest to everyone very quickly is communicate with your tenant, look after your tenant, because generally what we hear about arrears is the extreme end. So I don't want to panic.
Well, I'm sure the media would never sensationalise such a thing, would they?
Ignore Shelter. Shelter have got a campaign
Surely that wouldn't happen.
About anti-landlords, but there is something to be learned by actually just spending an evening a week checking your records.
Shelter, just no disrespect to them, I'm sure their intentions are worthy, but if they continue to bash landlords, as Paul and I were talking about earlier, there won't be any landlords left, and therefore there'll be a big social housing problem. So Shelter should be very, very careful. Chris, optimistic or pessimistic for next year for landlords?
I'm absolutely optimistic. I think Eddie's summed that up. There is a lot of... Sorry, I'm not too far away again. I'm actually distracted because I worked with David for a few years and couldn't get him near data.
It's changed. That's definitely changed.
He could not add up, and I'm amazed now that he's quickly doing some sums. So
I'm not actually doing
not
sums.
sure.
All I'm doing is reading off the spreadsheet.
Someone else's data.
Go to say they are very, very small words in big type.
So I'll try and steal his points off his screen before he gets to it. But no, I think there's every reason to be optimistic. I mean, as I said before, there's a qualifier there. If you're hit with arrears, it's a really tough time. And you do need the services of people like Paul to bring these to an end. But actually, if you're in the market, we don't record rent prices or property prices in our data, but we record perceived demand. And we're seeing higher perceived demand in almost all of the country from our members than we've ever seen in the 15 years we've been tracking this. So it is completely counter-cyclical. It's really interesting to hear Marc talk about London, because there may be a lag in our data. If there's one area where I'd say some of our members are pessimistic, it is in central London, where they're not reporting the high demand to us.
So this is insofar as tenant demand?
Tenant demand, yes.
And therefore, and house prices too? Or do you not get that reflected?
We
I
don't
suppose, as an
really
organisation?
pick that up. I mean, our members transact very frequently, so they are consumers of properties, but they don't report to us what they're paying. They report to us in terms of yield, and they're always looking for a deal. But I think there's optimism in terms of tenant demand. I think there's optimism in terms of we'll get me in stereo in a minute. But, optimism in terms of desire to acquire more property by landlords around the country, and that actually was at a 10-year high for us in terms of perceived demand last quarter. And therefore, every reason to think that these businesses are going to be successful. I think we'll probably get onto in a minute. There are some uncertainties around regulation in our sector. That's something that landlords are really going to have to plan for. I don't think it's the end of the world, but it's something we've got to plan for. But yeah, absolutely, every reason to be optimistic. And David's closed his laptop. So
David's got some data, I think, for us. So David, on Rightmove, are you optimistic about next year from a landlord perspective? Recession, no recession? Are we going to see kind of inflation temper, or are we going to kind of fall off a cliff economically, do you think?
So I think if you look at what we've had over the last 12 months, and really over the last 2 years, I was quickly trying to pull the house price data, because I pulled the rent data earlier, but not the actual price data. And what I would say is, bear in mind, Rightmove's data is based on the price that it goes on the market, not the price it actually goes for. So this is asking price data. We don't have the stats for what it actually goes for. But to give you an idea, rent at the moment across the UK is up 8.59% on 2019, with an average UK rent of £1,210. And again, asking rent, not necessarily achieved rent. That is quite substantially different in London. Average rent is £2,090 a month, which is up 7.59%, so 7.6% up on 2019. House prices actually show quite a different set of stats. So we're up 9.95% in terms of asking prices across the country at the moment, based on 2019. And in London, that is up just 4.22%. What I would say, though, the values are wildly different. £340,000 is the average asking price in the UK at the moment, and it is just shy of £650,000 in London. Interestingly, there's also a bit of a difference between 2020 as well. So 9.95% above, so basically 10% above 2019 levels, 6.4% above 2020 levels. So it has actually jumped quite a lot this year. Is there going to be a levelling? I think the answer is there probably will, because this is quite substantial house price growth, and probably more than if you look at the trends over, and you take the sort of the 2020 blip out of it, you take the trends over the last 2 years versus the trends over the previous 2 years, it was rising much, much faster.
And David, on balance, if you were a landlord with a portfolio, would you be now considering expanding that portfolio or shedding units into next year? What would you do?
I would probably be on a hold, actually, at the moment. Not buying, not selling. I think we've got to see how the market reacts. And when we get onto the legislative aspects as well, there are always two sides to whether now is necessarily the right time to buy, whether it's the right time to shed.
Thank you. Marc, same question. And actually, from the data that David has given us there, London looks like it's seeing an increase in yields. So if house prices are not growing that much, but rents certainly are, London owners are seeing an increase in yields. That's interesting.
I think increase in yields is percentage. I think it's not a huge amount. You know, I think someone said earlier about the fact that you don't look at it. I think Eddie said earlier about you look at your ISA and your shares every day, you don't look at your house price. And it's a nice illiquid asset that you don't ever look at the price of, your price of your house. You buy it for £200,000. You don't look at it every month or every week or every day. How much has it gone up or down like you do with equities? And so when everybody's talking about increase in yields, it's only because rents have become a bit stronger. And I think that rent that's become stronger is compared with last year. I think, the market, don't get me wrong, is incredibly busy, but your yields are still going to be in London anywhere from super prime centre for sub 2% up to 5% if you're in some of the further, zone 5 areas. But, let's be honest, if you can get something in a decent area on a 4% yield and you buy now and you're paying 1%, I mean, someone's just brought out a buy-to-let landlord interest rate of 0.7%. I mean, if you can lock that in for 2 years and you're paying 5% and that's on 70%, I think, loan to value, even if you get 60% loan to value, you're looking on your cash that you put in, taking off the stamp duty cost and taking off the fact that everybody says negative, you're still looking at 7% on your money. You cannot get 7%. And this is let's look at the reason I'm, focus on the asset is because who are the wealthiest people in the UK, save for the odd oligarch that pops in and out? They're all major landlords, the Grosvenor Estate, Cadogan Estate and the Crown. The biggest estates in the UK are owned by them, and they've held them for hundreds of years. And the Grosvenor and Howard Walden Estate, which are two of big as London, have been expanding portfolios, buying stuff. Why? Because values are good at the moment. You can buy buildings. And so in terms of where values go, just quickly, I think it is going to be 5%, and I think it'll be up and down depending what you buy. It's only 5% as a guide. You get someone who's desperate to sell, you're going to get a better deal. If you buy something brand new off plan, you're going to see less of a growth in a shorter period of time. But I think it's rosy.
So on the basis that, as you're saying, property is not a short-term thing. You're not investing for 6 to 12 months. Interestingly, actually, the FTSE, so the FTSE 100 is about 600 points lower now than it was this time last year. So if you'd chosen to invest in property against all the odds 12 months ago, you'd certainly be quidsing compared to the equities that Marc's talked about. So optimist.
I'm
Thumbs up. Good. Okay, right. Let's talk about the thorny issue of regulation. David, what's coming down the tracks next year? Well, and Chris, because this is your sweet spot, both of you. What's not coming down the tracks?
As this is your more you, I will let you go first.
Before someone else tells me they can't hear me, I'll turn that around before we start. Well, what aren't we going to see?
Well, it's been very thorny, hasn't it, over the last 2 or 3 years? So can landlords expect another kicking legislatively?
Always they can. I think there's 4 main areas at the moment we've got to be wary of. So we've probably done the COVID restrictions and the like to death, but we should remember one thing. The government may have rescinded most of those, but they've kept the right to reapply them should they need to. So for the next year or so, we've got to be quite wary here. If the numbers start going in the wrong direction, we could see a return, and that's going to be the big issue. I think in only, 2 weeks' time, we've got the budget. I think if we... You haven't got to be a great observer of the media at the moment to know that all of the speculation is around what will happen to wealth. I think being completely realistic, you've got to look at the announcements over national insurance contribution about NICs a little while ago and the backlash they had there about targeting earned income and not touching unearned income. And no matter how hard landlords out there, all of the NRLA's members, all of our clients work, it's classed as unearned income. And that's what we're going to be looking at here. We're going to be looking at capital gains. Heaven forbid we could look at deductions for income tax again. I wouldn't take anything off of the table at the moment. So tax is going to be the next big issue. Then you've got 2 other parts to that. You've got energy efficiency, which everybody's eyes glaze over when you mention it, my own included, because it's an incredibly dull subject, and David will know I used to delegate it all to him when we worked together at the NRLA.
Chris, you're not going to give us a lecture on Insulate Britain now, are you?
No, I've already superglued myself to the chair now. That's why I'm just staying here for the rest of the day. I checked. I drove down the M11 today and I checked just in case I got caught in another one of their expletive deleted protests. But anyway, so I think next week we're going to see the government's heat and building strategy finally published, which is very, very delayed now. But we've got about, and David might correct me on these stats again, being the stat man now, I think about 15% of our emissions in the UK come from residential building. We've got to tackle that in some way. The PRS has a very large proportion of pre-1919 stock and very hard to treat stock. And actually, I'd say now, keep an eye out next week. We've got the heat and building strategy coming out. The NRLA, with a think tank called Localis, is also publishing a report on proposals for how to deal with that, how to fund it. And I would say, actually, energy efficiency for the next 5 to 10 years is going to be the biggest challenge that landlords face, because it is going to cost billions to renovate.
So they're going to be forced to put measures in place, or maybe be taxed differently if they haven't?
Potentially not the latter. I think they may actually just be excluded from the marketplace if they haven't. And then the big ticket item that gets talked about a lot more, I think, than energy efficiency, but probably isn't going to be as big in the next few years, is rental reform. And we've been waiting for the renters reform bill for a couple of years now. It's been toned down a little bit, but we are, and I wouldn't like to place a bet on exactly when we're going to see the white paper and then the bill itself. But in that run-up to the next election, we're going to see progress on this. And I don't see any indication that there's going to be any backtracking on removing no-fault possessions or some of the other measures. And actually, without wanting to sound too negative about it, I think there's actually some positive things for our market in there as well. We're working with government, the department that used to be MHCLG, now DLUC, about what we actually need in terms of possession, what we need in terms of grounds, what we need the courts to do, because as Paul said earlier on, that backlog is not going anywhere and we need to find a way to work through that. But also in terms of alternative dispute, I think there's a lot of positive work that will stem from this in terms of using mediation more and in terms of using redress. I've got the expert on redress to my left, I won't talk about that too much, but how we can actually roll that out to the rest of the marketplace and get landlords more involved there as well, to avoid having to go to court so often, and maybe to improve the perception of landlords a little bit.
Well, I hope so. And David, anything to add to Chris's Grim Reaper outlook?
So, actually, no. I think those are all the key points. I totally agree with you. We've lived without Section 21 basically for 18 months now, and we're going to live without Section 21 for, probably the next 6 to 12 months, because of the sheer length of time. They're not doing a first-come, first-served basis in the court system any longer. It's a worst-first approach. So Section 21 keeps going down to the bottom of the list. Therefore, and the fact that we've lived without Section 21, if we can get the sort of reforms that the NRLA are campaigning for, as are a number of bodies, then we've just become kind of hooked on Section 21. It's what we've had for 30 years. If we can actually find something that's better, and it might work better for all parties, we might be able to bring in the sort of alternative dispute resolution that does work well in other industries. Yeah, and we need... So that one, although it's the one that everybody is so terrified about, I don't think it's going to be as bad as possibly everybody thinks it's going to be. However, I completely agree on the energy efficiency. They are talking about a minimum £10,000 spend to get it up to an EPC Band C by 2025. Now, £10,000 for a property in London is a lot of money. But you look at the rent of a property in Newcastle, £10,000 is 2+ years' rent. How are they going to get the money to actually be able to do that sort of retrofit? It's just not practical for the vast majority, especially when you consider that we have the largest percentage of pre-1919 stock of anywhere in Europe. And you couple that with the minimum EPC requirements, they're going to get rid of a lot of the exemptions that are there, or just make the exemptions so difficult to actually achieve. And I have to say that then couples with some of the reforms that they are placing around what you can and can't say about a property. The consumer protection from unfair trading regulations have been with us since 2008, and it specifies whether you're an agent or a private landlord, what you're allowed to say about your property. And there is work going on at the moment that is going to force the portals, be it Rightmove or any of the other portals, that we will not be allowed to list properties if they don't meet a certain list of criteria. So an EPC, for example, if they don't meet the criteria, it's work ongoing at this moment in time, but they don't want us to be to actually allow the listing to go live if it doesn't meet the minimum energy efficiency standard.
Lots to consider there. Briefly, Eddie, and then Marc, if you can, because I want to get on some questions. Eddie, anything else coming down the tracks? Regulation, licensing?
I'll agree with everything that David and Chris says. Very quickly, my view, 27% now is the private rented sector in terms of occupancy. So you've got your owner occupied, then you've got 27% of properties and families in the UK are now renting. It is not under the radar anymore. What this government has proven is that they are not scared, like previous governments, to make the big decisions. And Brexit, yeah, social care, breaking manifesto pledges to increase tax. They are going to use their time to push the private rented sector up the agenda. Yeah, I think it's a good thing. I think it has to be done carefully and measured. I sit on a lot of working parties with the government, with DLUC, what used to be the MHCLG, and they're not scared of making these decisions. Yes, things will be delayed a bit, like the Renters Reform Act and things like that, but they are going to push them
It can only be a
forward.
good thing in terms of standard of accommodation,
We all
as
want-
long as landlords aren't bashed to such an extent that being a landlord becomes
Absolutely.
uneconomic.
Absolutely.
But
The balancing act, very quickly, is that there is no social care, no social housing,
Yeah.
or very little.
Well, that's left
so they
up to
have
private
tread
landlords
that
to
line
provide, yes.
of keeping the landlords incentivised, but at the end of the day, 8 million tenants in the UK are 8 million votes.
Yes.
And that's what governments are looking at. It's about votes at the end of the day. So the future for me will be landlords are going to be under more pressure to make sure their properties are in a good state of repair, that rents are controlled a little bit more, that tenants are not turfed out onto the social housing and the social benefit end.
Eddie, thank you. Marc, very quickly, anything to be concerned about, anything to be mindful of as a landlord next year?
It's not something that's coming, it's something that's already here, is licensing, which is the biggest issue I've ever seen, and I think it just continues to be an issue. So in certain boroughs of London, and none of them are the same, you have to have a license as a landlord if you let to 2 or more people, or 2 or more households, sorry, David probably knows it, and 3 or more people. The problem is that costs on average £400 to £500 for the licence. Most landlords, if they let to one person, don't need the licence, and you find that out afterwards that the couple have moved in and they've actually got 2 kids, or they're letting their nanny stay with them, or they're having their friend come and live with them in their 3-bedroom house. It all of a sudden needs a licence. You haven't got a licence, you can't evict them, you have to give them all their rent back, and you get a great big whacking fine. I think it's shocking, and it's the one thing that was sat in one of these meetings that they have that I don't sit on anymore, because they talk as though they're going to take into account what we say from an industry perspective, and then they just go off and do their own thing because they think it's better. And the licensing, I think, is the one that will get hit. More and more landlords will get hit. And Newham, you look at the fines that they take, the money they take in fines from landlords, it's astronomical. And I really, I say anybody that's got a property, that was actually should have been my concern earlier. Make sure you're in a borough, you've got a house. Oh, and the other best thing is some councils don't have it on the whole borough. They have a line through the borough and say everybody to the left has got to have a licence, but everybody to the right doesn't need a licence, because obviously they think they're obviously more trustworthy people, and that line goes through the middle of certain streets with the same postcode.
I think what we've established in the last 10 or 15 minutes is that landlords need to be, they need to make sure they've engaged a good agent, that they're members of Chris's organisation, and that they're keeping close to the likes of Eddie's organisation and indeed David's at Rightmove to make sure that all of the advice and guidance that you need, you actually become exposed to, because it's complex and fast moving.
And selling Newham.
Yes, yeah.
Can I just say as well, if anybody wants more details on the licensing, there is a panel on that one later in the afternoon.
Which you happen to be on, do you?
Might be, yeah.
Okay, so in our last few minutes, it'd be great to get not just questions, but opinions and experiences from people in the audience. Whether you're prospective landlords, whether you're current landlords. So, does anybody have a question or anything to say before Andrew goes again? Because he's already had a turn. He's greedy. Yes.
Hi, my name is Julie. It's
Hey,
a
Julie.
question to the panel, really. I just want to pick up on what Eddie said about the laziness of landlords, and I know that was a general term, not all landlords.
Oh, Eddie's in trouble.
No, not at all. I want to echo that, actually, and to just say I think a lot of that is linked to cost, because landlords predominantly only have 1 or 2 properties. There aren't so many larger portfolio landlords out there, and that cost obviously goes back to whether they engage with an agent or not. And I think industry as a whole, the letting agents
Sorry, Julie,
aren't
bear with me. Sorry, I think you're about to get... Nick, is there a microphone coming? You're talking so much sense, Julie, we want to actually get it on camera properly. You should be on the panel next time. Just bear with us, sorry to interrupt you. Keep that thread, keep that thread. I don't know if it will go over, will it? That's strange.
Innovation.
Well done, thank you, well done.
I'm loving it.
Carry on.
Yeah, so what I was saying was a lot of the laziness, I think, is linked to cost. And with one or two properties in their portfolio, landlords are looking at literally cutting as much cost as possible. And I see myself personally, a lot of people revert to social media to get their legal advice rather than picking up the phone to a solicitor. And I don't think people see the value in letting agents and what they can actually do for a landlord. And as we all know sitting here today, don't we, there are currently 168 pieces of law and 400 regulations that govern the private rented sector. If you had one piece of advice to give to a landlord to convince them to use an agent and promote the value of that agent, what would it be?
Julie, are you an agent by any chance? Are you declaring an interest here?
I work for Eddie.
Oh, I see, right.
I'm going to quickly...
Well, Eddie answer.
Yeah, can I quickly say, look, I don't agree. I'm going to say this openly. I don't agree that the only way to be a successful landlord is to use a letting agent. I think there are some very good letting agents out there, and I think if you are going to use a letting agent, use one, especially if you are not local, yeah, or you do not have the time, or you do not have the inclination. But I think the self-managed market can be successful. What I would echo, Julie, is that landlords need to make sure they get the right advice. So I've got the gentleman here. Make sure that you join a landlord association. Make sure you look at their suppliers and use their suppliers because they've been vetted. You know, we don't just set up business as Hamilton Fraser with all of our products. We are vetted by government, by landlord associations, by portals, by letting agents, by other organisations. And I think it's very tempting to cut corners, but you need to find the right information. Yes, use a letting agent for maybe you don't have to use it all self-managed, but if you don't just leave yourself alone, is my argument. Join a landlord association, look for the right advice. If you can't be bothered with that, quite right, not a problem. It can be 7, 8, 9, 10% of your income to use a letting agent. But if you can't be bothered, find a proper letting agent that is Property Mark regulated, that you know has got client money protection if the rent isn't paid. You buy rent guarantee insurance from them if that's what they sell. You make sure that the letting agent you are using is a decent bunch of people.
Marc has to disagree with you, surely, Marc, that you can only ever succeed as a landlord if you use an agent, Marc, surely.
No, well, to be fair, it's a really good point. Obviously, we're an agent, and I think we offer a decent service. I do actually kind of agree with Eddie. You don't have to use an agent for everything. Of course you don't. You don't have to use us for managed. About 20% of our landlords are let only. The point with it is I think the lazy word is not fair. I think most landlords don't think, and they just expect the rent to hit their bank every month. And the number of our landlords that contact us at the year end and say, I haven't seen my rent this year. And why? Because they haven't told us they changed their bank account, or they told us that they were changing their bank account and could you put their rent on hold, and then they don't realise why their account's gone massively overdrawn to pay their, and we're sitting on the money and we write to them. It's the fact that if you are exact and you are going to make sure that you go and you check your property, then absolutely manage it yourself. You're going to do as good a job as I can, except for the legislation. But
Marc,
the one thing I was going to say is that you have to, go on, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, what is the one thing, to answer the question, that someone should use an agent for? What's the biggest reason, the biggest benefit for having an agent as opposed to not using an agent?
I think it's compliance. That was the word. Compliance is what I'd say. Just to make sure that licensing, that's a big one which will catch you. Lots of landlords don't think if the rent is above a certain level that they have to pay tax on it. Some overseas landlords don't realise that they have to pay tax at all. And compliance is the biggest thing, making sure, you have an EPC certain levels, oh my God, if it goes to C level, I dread to think, but if it's checking stuff like that. Someone has to check it. Gas safety. You're a landlord, you move the tenant in, you forget about the gas safety, there's a leak and the tenant dies, you're going to go to jail. You know, these are key issues that happen every day. Returning the deposit. And the worst is, you know, things like licensing, but these other kind of problems. If you don't do it right, you can't even evict the tenant if they're not paying you rent. You have to give them their flipping rent back. I mean,
so this is
really important.
a very, very good a good grandstanding as to why you should use an agent for sure. I guess you'd have to support that, wouldn't you, David? Given that your customers are agents, you couldn't possibly say anything else, could you?
Well,
Give it a good go, David.
give it a good go. Well, I suppose the answer is it's compliance. There are so many different laws, and the penalties are so huge. They are at bankruptcy level if somebody actually, if authorities go after you at this point in time now. What I would say, though, about using an agent is make sure that they are a professional agent. There are laws that govern agents now. Hadn't been for a long time, but agents have to have client money protection. That is protecting your rent that they are collecting. If they don't have it and they go bust or they run off into the night, and I've got plenty of horror stories of agents that have done that. My favourite one is Arla owned a Welsh pony for a short period of time that it managed to get off an agent who had stolen £375,000 of her client's money. And Arla gave it back to them. So make sure your agent has client money protection. And having come from Property Marc and the Association of Residential Letting Agents, I didn't realise quite the level of agents that are non-compliant. Rightmove vets all of its new customers. And looking at the level of customers that get rejected because they haven't got CMP, they aren't registered with the redress scheme, they aren't registered with the Information Commissioner's Office, and they get told, no, you're not allowed to advertise until you go away. Get all of those, bring it back, then we will let you advertise. That is a shockingly high percentage. It's well into double figures, is all I would say. So just be careful.
Chris, quick response from you. Do you care if your landlords are using agents or not? I mean, they're coming direct to you, so presumably you're the oracle rather than the agent, are you?
We're certainly not an agent. I mean, my instinct is to ask David about the Welsh pony, but we haven't got time for that one.
Let's do that over beers later.
We'll do that afterwards. I think
sounds like a long story.
Yeah, I would echo what I think everyone has said. You know, if you're going to use an agent, use a good agent. I declare an interest. I used to be a letting agent at one point. I probably wasn't that good.
That's not a great advert. That's not a great advert for the NRLA.
I'm going to be honest about that. Best part of 20 years ago, the regulations are different, and honestly, we didn't vet people a great deal when we recruited them. But and all I mean by that is you can't assume just because you're using an agent that takes away all of your responsibilities. Yeah. I think some of the worst cases we have referred to us that we have through our advice line at the NRLA are people who went to an agent, they checked that they were a member of one of the schemes, and then they forgot about the property. They just left it to them, and they thought
so you still have a responsibility as an individual.
And you have a really significant legal responsibility for absolutely everything. Yeah. And we have many cases of members who call us up because they are looking at a 60, 70, 80,000 pound bill in the courts because they didn't check up on that agent.
Yeah,
so
good
the
advice.
best thing you can do ultimately is join the association, obviously stand 215,
Plug.
£75 a year, and we'll tell you exactly what you need to ask that agent when you take them on.
Shameless plug over.
Absolutely.
We've probably got time for one more question. Andrew, I know you had one. Fire away. Yeah.
So yeah, I'd say my principal focus at the moment is on the wider economy. We're in a situation where we've recklessly and foolishly cut off our trading links with our major trading partner. We're seeing the impact on that on everything from pig farms to the ability to get gas in our
Andrew,
tanks.
this isn't Parliament, so let's not have a political debate.
No, I understand that. Well, that you asked for opinions and questions, so that's my opinion. The question, I mean, that's fact, but the question I've got to the panel is: have we overlooked the risk to the wider economy, particularly of entrenched stagflation? A 1970s style recession coupled with inflation that we have all but forgotten about as a society.
All right, I don't know who wants to answer that. Who's the economist on the panel? Order hesitation. What can I'll say one thing that we do need to be careful, and notwithstanding the fact that we are in a very unusual and undoubtedly precarious position economically. There's no textbook for where we are insofar as the whole Brexit and COVID implications, but I would just urge a bit of caution when it comes to media and the hype that goes around the negativity that is piled in on by the media, where any iota of negativity then is turned into a massive headline, as in, this is going to happen. I frankly got sick to the back teeth 18 months ago of so-called expert talking about the fact that we were going to see huge drops in pricing, in house prices, we were going to see recession, we were going to see unemployment at 5 million and so on. None of those things have happened. So I would urge caution. Look, does anyone do very quickly? So I've just got the nod that we've got to get out of here because we've overrun. But
I would
David?
just like to make one point. It's something that we've been talking about for a long time, that I think there is a new generation of landlords who have actually forgotten that interest rates used to be in double digits. That, and it is. We have almost got a little bit drunk on cheap credit. If we, we've had since what, 2007, 2008, interest rates at all-time lows, including the buy-to-let rates. So we do have to remember that we are not going to live forever on these bargain basement interest rates. The Bank of England is going to go back up. I think historically the average Bank of England base rate is somewhere around 6%. It's not going to live at, just forgot what it is.
0.1.
Yeah.
The 30-year average prior to 2009 was about 7.4%. And I know when I joined what was the NLA, we used to advise our members to plan on 9%.
Yeah. I think we should all be crazily optimistic, Andrew. Right, look, that's all we've got time for. Thank you to the audience, thank you to the panel. Very, very quickly, there is Paul Champlina, very quickly, 1:45. You're talking about how to be a professional landlord. That would be a very, very compelling panel, I think. But thanks to my panel, to Marc, to David, to Chris, and to Eddie. Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for being here. I think it was a great session. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.